Welcome to another episode of Fixing Bugs in Democracy, coming at you from Princeton University. My name is Sam Wang. I'm a professor of neuroscience. I'm also the proprietor of the Princeton Election Consortium and of the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. We are so pleased to be coming at you. And today we have a very special guest. Let me just tell you about today. First off, right here on camera, we have none other than Mr. Beto O'Rourke coming at you from San Antonio, Texas. And we're going to be talking today about redistricting and the Texas State House and coming up with fair representation and what's happening in this last stretch of the presidential and down ticket races. So that's our topic today. And Mr. O'Rourke is with us for half an hour. And then later, after he takes off, we're going to talk about some tools that are being developed at Princeton for fair districting. We're going to talk about redistricting Moneyball, a feature that we've figured out here at election.princeton.edu. And we're going to talk about Representable, which is a tool to let communities speak up for themselves. And that's available at representable.org. So we got all that, but that will all come later. Let's use our precious time with Beto. Beto, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Grateful to be with you and looking forward to the conversation and really appreciate your work. I have cited it as I try to make the case to my fellow Texans and the rest of the country that the state legislative races that that we're supporting across Texas not only have the power to change the composition of the Texas House ahead of an important redistricting year, but they will have other impacts up and down the ballot to include, giving Joe Biden a fighting chance of winning the 38 electoral college votes here in Texas on election night. So really grateful for what you're doing and looking forward to talking about it.
Great. So now you come at this with a lot of expertise. You're a Texan, and you recently ran against Senator Ted Cruz, and political junkies know that was a pretty remarkable run. It activated a lot of Texans, and you ended up carrying the vote in a majority of state legislative districts. And so I'm curious about how that's translated to. It's called Powered by People. Is that the organization that's powering this?
That's right. Yeah, we essentially in 2017 and 2018 were the beneficiary of the largest grassroots political movement in the history of Texas. More than 20,000 Texans picked up a clipboard and knocked on the doors of their neighbors and perfect strangers to encourage them to turn out in that midterm election. And as you know from your work, midterms, especially in Texas, tend to favor Republican turnout over Democratic performance. And yet, despite Texas having ranked 50th in voter turnout in midterm elections prior to 2018, all of us together, especially those volunteers, produced the biggest midterm voter turnout in Texas history since 1970. And I became the first Democrat in the state of Texas to win the counties that surround the four major urban areas since LBJ did it in 1964. So that was a watershed election. But what I think we all realized is that it really was the prologue to this election in 2020. And so we've essentially tried to get the band back together and reached out to all those volunteers and asked them not to focus necessarily on the top of the ticket, as important as those races are, but to pick up a clipboard at the beginning of the year and then a phone when it no longer became possible because of COVID, and reach out to voters in competitive state house districts where we are only at a 9-seat deficit from winning majority for the first time in 20 years. And so far, Powered by People have made more than 50 million voter contact attempts. We just had a phone bank last night where we made over 500,000 phone calls. We have another one tonight, anyone watching. And we also helped to register just under 200,000 voters over the last 6 months. And that is part of the 1.9 million who've registered in Texas over the last 4 years. Compare that to a typical 4-year registration cycle, you'll get about 700,000 new registrants in Texas. So we've almost tripled registration performance in the fastest growing state and the most diverse swing state in the country. So a lot of exciting things happening here right now.
That's outstanding. Now, just to back up, I think for people who don't necessarily follow these things closely, redistricting is on the line. Texas, I guess now has 36 congressional districts. And the current estimate is that if there's a proper count, which is an if, I think it's going to be up to 39 districts in Texas next time around. Does that sound right to you?
That's the assumption I'm making as well.
Yeah, and so that's a lot of redistricting, a lot of power. Texas is famous for redistricting disputes. And so if your team is successful, you'll be part of an effort that brings bipartisan redistricting to Texas. And when was the last time there was bipartisan redistricting in Texas? It seems like it's been a while.
Yeah, last time Democrats had a majority in the state house was 2001. So it's been about 20 years. And as you know, the gerrymandering of Texas has taken a real pernicious, unconstitutional, and racist turn. It is essentially a racial gerrymander. And those are not my words. Those are the words of 3 federal judges who in 2017 found our districts to be unconstitutional because literally the state legislature, Republican controlled, drew out Black and Mexican American Texans from a given district to diminish the power and impact of their vote and the likelihood that they would vote at all. And that's how you become 50th in voter turnout in the country. It's not for any lack of love for democracy. We love it just as much as you all do in New Jersey. It is because we were literally drawn that way. And so to have Democrats with a seat at the table again in 2021, as you say, after we pick up perhaps 3 new congressional districts, gives us a chance to draw people back in and to have a shot at fair maps and fair districts, which would take us from, we never really were so much a red state as a non-voting state. It could take us from non-voting to voting. And you know, the diversity, the genius of this state of 30 million, I think could really come through in our government and the electoral process. So a lot hinges on these state house races.
And so, and now, just to get into the weeds a tiny bit, let's say that Texas Democrats succeed in retaking the state house. So that can be a bipartisan process for redistricting. There's state legislative districts and there's congressional districts. So the congressional process, that has to be bipartisan, right? Because it's a regular statute, isn't that right? As opposed to a deadlock.
That's right, yeah. That's right.
Yeah, but the state legislature, that's a tougher process, isn't it? Because there's this backup commission. And so that seems like a little bit hard. Do you have any thoughts on what to do to help make the state legislative lines fairer?
I mean, ultimately, and this is where I'd probably defer to you in your work, but ultimately, I think you need a non-political process. I mean, take the politicians literally out of the room and the decision making, right, and draw maps that are true single member representational districts. And if you look at the maps in Texas, they're the most obscenely unconstitutional of any that I've seen in the country. And again, remember that so much of that is based on race and ethnicity and country of national origin in terms of how these districts are drawn. So finding a nonpartisan, far more objective way to build these single member districts is the path that I would want us to pursue.
I'm curious about your thoughts about ways to address this at a national level. I mean, for example, the Shelby County case was very unfavorable for racial fairness in districting. It struck down a whole section of the Voting Rights Act. And here we are walking into an election. There may or may not be a change in the Senate. And so it's possible that there'll be a new Congress, new president, and one can imagine a chance to revisit this. Do you have thoughts about what can or should be done in your old stomping grounds in the House of Representatives?
Yeah, so it's interesting that we're talking about this within the context of Texas. It was a Texan, of course, who 55 years ago signed into law the Voting Rights Act, Lyndon Baines Johnson, in 1965. And really, in my experience, Texas makes the case for a Voting Rights Act. Within minutes of the Shelby decision and Justice Bader Ginsburg's fiery dissent in that decision, Texas imposed the most onerous voter ID laws in the country. For example, you are able to use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are at your polling place, but you cannot use your student ID at the University of Texas at El Paso, a minority serving institution, to prove who you are at your polling place. In addition to that, 750 polling places have been closed in Texas since Shelby. That is more than any other state by at least a factor of 2 or maybe even 3. And that's at a time that we are the fastest, or at least one of the fastest growing states in the country. And probably no surprise to those who are watching this right now, but the majority of those polling place closures occurred in those communities with the fastest growing Black and Latino populations. In addition, just within the last couple of weeks, our Republican Governor, Greg Abbott, unilaterally closed all of the supplementary absentee ballot drop-off locations in any one of the 254 counties of Texas that had one. To put that in real terms, in Harris County, which has 5 million people, that's the home to Houston, Texas, more constituents there than in the state of Nevada. Now that those supplemental drop-off polling sites have been closed, you might have to drive 50 miles, 50 miles, in order to drop off your ballot if you don't understandably trust placing that in a mailbox, given the fact that our president has admitted to slowing down the US mails to advance his advantage in this election. So
one drop box, is it a big drop box? Because that's a big county.
Yeah, right. So right, it's all been reduced to one drop box in the center of the county. I don't know physically how big that is, but
that'd be big.
Yeah, but obviously this is an attempt to suppress voting. Somebody might just say, you know what, screw it. I'm not going to get in my car and drive 50 miles. I don't trust the U.S. mails. They're making it so hard on me to vote. I'm just not going to do it. But the interesting response, and one other thing, yesterday, Greg Abbott announced he's activating 1,000 members of the state guard to somehow keep the peace around elections because of all the riots you all have been reading about in Texas. That's said sarcastically. There are no riots in Texas. There's no need to send 1,000 members of the state guard out. But they see record turnout in the face of record suppression as cause for concern. And so they're throwing the kitchen sink at the state. All of this comes back to the answer to your question. You need a Congress and a president who make voting rights a priority, because only through voting rights, I believe, is anything else that you want to do possible. Universal health care, confronting climate change, reducing gun violence, criminal justice and policing reform. You need the people most affected by these issues to actually have a chance to vote, to direct the course of the conversation and the policy that follows. So I think that has to be at the top, if not the very first priority for the next administration and the next Congress.
So I'm wrapping my head around this, because here in Princeton, where it's a small town, it's this town of about 30,000 people, we have one drop box, but 30,000 people compared with millions. So what kinds of things are being done either by you guys or by others to help people vote, to help those people who have to drive 50 miles or what have you? What kinds of strategies can be taken to counter these difficulties?
So last night I mentioned we had a phone bank, and there were 650 of us making phone calls. We made over 500,000 phone calls to Texas voters who have yet to vote. And on those phone calls, we're not persuading voters. We're not selling a candidate or a political party. We'll call and we'll say, hey, Sam, this is Beto from Powered by People. Early voting is through the 30th of October, this coming Friday. Have you made a plan to vote yet? You may say, you know what, I don't know where my nearest polling place is. And then I'd say, you can actually vote at any early voting location in your county. Here, why don't I tell you where your closest one is? It looks like Austin Middle School is a half mile from your home. It's open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. tomorrow. You think you could get there before you go to work? You say yes. We make a plan.
So you coach people through the voting plan. Like, you actually coach people through it.
Absolutely. We make a plan and confirm it. And then if you have not voted tomorrow or through the course of early voting, you're going to get another phone call from us. Hey, Sam, looks like you didn't get a chance to vote during early voting. Election day is tomorrow. Can I count on you to vote tomorrow? Here's your polling location. And here's what you need to bring with you. And we'll go through the valid identification that you need to bring to prove your identity when you're at the polling place. But we're doing that. There are great candidates who are doing that. And then the Texas voter has stepped up and stood up to be counted at this moment. I got a text from a friend in Fort Bend County, which is adjacent to Harris County in Southeast Texas. First day of early voting, there was a problem with the voting machines there that pushed the vote back by about 2 hours. The line extended half a mile. He waited for 7-8 hours to cast his ballot, but did it. And I think there's this interesting response to the level of voter intimidation here. If they're working this hard to stop me from voting, then my vote must be pretty damn important. And so I'm going to stay in this line until I get a chance to cast it. I think that's exciting, although it's not guaranteed that we will maintain this trajectory. And so that's why we're doing the phone calls. And then today I'm in Bexar County, which is home to San Antonio. And I'm actually knocking on doors with a grassroots organizing group called the Texas Organizing Project that exclusively knocks on the doors of Black Texans, Latino Texans, specifically those Texans in communities of color whose votes have been suppressed and intimidated and excluded and disenfranchised in the past. We're intentionally going to their doors to help them make a plan to vote in person.
And I just wanted to say, you're in Bexar County in San Antonio. You're there for a reason, because you're there in the, what is it, the 121st district. Is that right, for Selena Montoya?
Yep. I just knocked on doors with Selena Montoya a little bit earlier. And as you can imagine, in San Antonio, as is the case in my hometown of El Paso, we're having conversations with voters in English. We're having conversations with voters in Spanish. And many of these voters we were unable to find by phone or by text, either because we couldn't get a hold of their number or because they changed their number or may not have a number. So going to their doors is critical, and been able to do it in a safe way.
And you're focusing, just to get into the weeds a little bit, you're focusing on districts that are flippable, that you deem to be possible to become Democratic districts. You've got a few in Austin, I guess. You're going to be going through there at all?
No, we'll next go. So we were in Harris County yesterday. And as you know, we've got Aquila Basie and Natalie Hurtado and Ann Johnson and a number.
There's eight swing districts in the Harris County area.
Yeah, it's amazing. And then the next big trove of possible swing districts is in the North Texas area. So Dallas County, Tarrant County, Collin County, Denton County, which, by the way, those last two counties have more than doubled their early voting results, at least on the first day of early voting from 2016.
Which two counties, Denton and Collin, you said?
Yep. So Harris County has gotten a lot of attention, as it deserves. First day of early voting, 128,000 votes cast, which was double the previous high water mark for a single day of early voting, and was more than all the ballots cast in the state of Georgia, an entire state, on their first day of early voting. But I believe Denton and Collin, as a percentage of past performance, exceeded Harris County. And as you all know, who know your Texas geography, these are the counties right next to Dallas and Tarrant County, which is home to Fort Worth. And they are among the fastest growing counties anywhere in the United States. They used to be very reliably red. They are trending very quickly blue, and they're growing very fast. And I mentioned 1.9 million registrations in Texas since 2016. A lot of that has taken place in North Texas. And so, Sam, you've identified Brandy Chambers, who's in that North Texas area.
That's
as
right.
Potentially, those constituents representing the greatest voter power in the state of Texas, maybe in America. There are other districts around Brandy's that are super competitive as well. So we'll be there starting tomorrow.
That's great, because I'm currently sharing it with our viewers. I'm showing the redistricting Moneyball feature that we have at election.princeton.edu. And I got to say, I was bowled over by the density of districts that are competitive, where voters are powerful, where if they get out and vote, they can have influence over who controls the Texas House. And the thing that really struck me about this is that my understanding is that Denton and Collin County were not Democratic leaning 10 years ago. That these are counties that have really changed in their flavor of who they favor and what kind of people, the diversity of people who live there.
They were previously so red that as you orbited the Earth, you could see them glowing from outer space. It was just, do not tread if you're a Democrat. And here we have, Sharon Hirsch, who's one of those districts in North Texas, I believe in Collin County, who lost last time by, I think, less than a percentage point.
Oh yeah,
who's
66
running.
district.
Yeah, and she fundraised nothing in 2018, and now has real resources at her back. That's another big difference from the last legislative cycle in 2018. These candidates were running on fumes by the end. You know, they'd raise $6,000-10,000. Now they're raising $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million in these races. You know, the Republicans know they're coming now, and so they're raising that money as well. But this is truly competitive at this point.
So I'm curious. By the way, I want to turn to questions in the remaining few minutes. There's a bunch of questions showing up in Q&A. Is that okay? I'll read them.
Absolutely.
So just want to get off of the political thing right now. While I have you here, I wanted to. You mentioned Lyndon Johnson, and I have read that you are about to go teach at Texas State University in San Marcos. And if I recall correctly, this used to be did that used to be a teacher's college where Lyndon Johnson went to school himself?
That's right. He went to the precursor to Texas State, same institution, and then went and taught school in I believe in Cotulla, and that experience, both the education and teaching a class of primarily Mexican American students, was a huge impact and influence on him right through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and certainly how he viewed access to education in the country. But yeah, there's a lot of history at Texas State, and I'm very excited and very honored that they've extended me the opportunity to teach there.
What are you going to be teaching?
Texas politics. So, yeah.
So let's see. Let me just turn to the questions here. There's just a few people here. Let me see here. So here's a question from, I believe, a student here at Princeton, Kesavan Struvili-Putur. And his question is a fairly general question. Mr. O'Rourke, what's your advice for Texas voters such as myself who are becoming disillusioned because too many people don't vote down ballot? And he's curious about how do you get people interested in down ballot voting? And it's a fairly general question.
It's such a good one, because one of the interesting dynamics of 2018 was, I mentioned we generated more voter turnout than at any time since 1970 in the midterm. We did so well at the top of the ticket, but there was an interesting thing that happened at the state representative level. We only need to pick up 9 districts to win a majority. Sam mentioned at the top that I won a majority of the state house districts, including 9 districts that are currently represented by Republicans. That means that we turned out a sufficient number of Democratic voters, or voters who would vote for a Democrat at the top of the ticket, where I won those districts. But those voters did not either vote all the way down the ballot, or they voted down the ballot and they switched parties, which actually happened to a significant degree in 2018. So for that reason, for the last year of my life, I've devoted every waking minute to supporting these state representative candidates and organizing in their districts. And our organization, Powered by People, and it is comprised of over 10,000 volunteers at this point who've made phone calls for us. We've really been helping the Jeff Whitfields, the Brandy Chambers, the Akila Bases, the Elisa Simmons. And by the way, something that should also encourage us, beyond the chance to pick up the state house, is that so many of these candidates, the Democratic candidates who are running challengers, are women. So many of them are women of color. So many of them are Black women. And if they win that majority, and also send voters up the ballot instead of, to your question, people coming down the ballot, go up the ballot and help Joe Biden win Texas on election night, there will be this really profound poetic justice and political justice in those candidates of color, those voter suppressed state along racial and ethnic lines in the country, helping Texas to come through for the rest of us. So I'm pretty excited about that. And I think that's where the energy and the action is. So I agree with you that it's concerning that hasn't worked out in the past. I think this year, in large part, actually, thanks to Dr. Wang's work and the work of others, folks in Texas and folks outside of Texas are focused on these legislative races right now, to include the Texas voter.
And I should say that Kesavan is not only a Princeton student, which I mentioned, he's also a Denton County voter. So he is right there in the middle of things. He was all surprised when I told him that Denton County was becoming kind of purple. I got another one here, Miguel Rivera. And Miguel Rivera says, hi, I'm the Redistricting Outreach Fellow at the Texas Civil Rights Project. And he has a question: how do you recommend keeping voters engaged in redistricting after the election? And I have to say, I think I want to know the answer to this as well. How to engage people in redistricting after the election?
Yeah, me too. I mean, Sam, you probably know the number after Senator Obama won the presidency in 2008, how many state legislative seats we lost over the next 12 years. I mean, it's in the thousands, right? Or at least
it's over 1,000, well over 1,000.
And so lesson learned for me, I mean, I worked my tail off for Senator Obama in Texas in the primary. I did so again in the general election. And when he won, I thought, you know, my work is done. Now, President Obama saved the country, and I'll sit back and watch. And what I have learned, and I think a lot of us have learned, is that actually following his victory is when the real work began. And while many Democrats didn't see that, the Republicans absolutely did. And they cleaned up in these state house races. They cleaned up in the redistricting process. And they produced majorities that we are only beginning to crack right now, 12 years after that fact. So should we be successful on the night of November 3rd and the days and weeks that follow as the votes are counted in other states, then I think it's really incumbent upon us, to the spirit of your question, to get to work on 2022, 2024, and then the redistricting process itself, which will begin in 2021. And my belief is the more transparent that is, the more accountable those state legislators feel to their constituents and to the rest of us in the public, the better the outcome is going to be. So the fact that you're even asking the question bodes well for the outcome.
I have to say, I think that I think Republicans, to their credit, they played a long game in making sure that they had control of the redistricting process. They did pretty well in the 2000 and 2010 cycle. And so it strikes me that this is a time when the institutions of democracy are looking kind of rickety, looking a little like they could use a little bit of repair. And so if people can get involved, be more attentive to it, it feels like a good time for ordinary people to do much more than the ordinary amount. So so I hope that that works out. And I just, on that note, I'm curious about how you feel about, oh, by the way, I should want to mention that one of the tools I know you have to go pretty soon, but one of the tools that we have going to help those citizens weigh in is at representable.org. And after you take off, Beto, we'll be showing people Representable, and it's a way for citizens to weigh in and make themselves known, to draw their communities and show redistrictors, look, this is who we are, this is where we work, this is where we live or worship or whatever it might be. And so we're hoping to make that as easy as possible and use the same kind of technology that, sometimes gets used for bad outcomes. And our view is that a cell phone can be just used to take a picture. It can be used to document abuses that's been so powerful for the Black Lives Matter movement. We're hoping that our tools are going to be the cell phones of fair districting. And so we're really hoping to be helpful to all those folks out there like Mr. Rivera and so on.
Great. Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. And I think, or I know that I'm encouraged at least by the number of everyday citizens who stepped up to engage in this election. I mentioned, Texas was 50th in voter turnout prior to the 2018 election. We're now number 1 in the country. Went from 50th to first place in votes cast, and then votes cast relative to 2016. And then the number of organized. What's that?
That's amazing. I'm just, my mind is blown because I'm seeing these stories about voter turnout in Texas. So it's real. It's like that.
We're approaching 8 million ballots cast. The political science term for it is it's bananas. It is inexplicable, other than the people of this state where democracy is being tested unlike any other place on the planet, as far as I'm concerned, are stepping up to the challenge and literally standing in that line for 7 or 8 hours. And then, to your point, it's no longer enough just to vote. It's no longer enough to express your outrage on Twitter or to post something snarky on Facebook. You are now compelled to make phone calls for 2 hours to complete strangers during their dinner time to help them make a plan to vote. So this is a really beautiful expression of democracy in a place where it is an open question here in Texas. So I'm encouraged. Doesn't mean that we're going to get the results that we want on election night, but I feel that they are possible in a way that I haven't in past years. So let's see what happens in 7 days.
All right. Well, good luck. And as you go to Harris County and Dallas-Fort Worth and Denton and Collin, I hope you take your vitamins. That's
I will. Thank you. Thanks for doing this, and thanks for putting the focus on Texas and redistricting in general, but really I think Texas, which is such a critical battleground in this country right now.
We are watching Texas closely. Good luck.
Adios. Bye-bye.
Adios. All right. Well, sorry that we didn't get to all the questions, but that was terrific. That was Beto O'Rourke. Let's continue now. It was really exciting to hear that. What I'd like to do is now flip it over to some other guests. If people are interested in election fairness, I've got a few things. I know that we don't have the star power of Beto O'Rourke, but we've got a few technical things that we'd love to show. What I'd like to do is invite onto the stage Dave Daly. Dave Daly, people may know as author of a book that really broke open the partisan gerrymandering story. And I'm just, because I'm kind of a blue nose, I'm just going to say it's rat effed. That's the name I'm going to give it. And he's got a new book, Unrigged, which is also about basically leveling the playing field for democracy nationwide. And Dave is going to be joining me, and we're going to also talk with, I'm going to just invite on camera Jacob Waxpress and Kyle Barnes. I just want people to see who these gentlemen are. They've been working with me here, and I just want to show them off. And what I want to do is thank you, Dave, for coming on from you're in Western Massachusetts, so thanks for joining. And then Jacob's in Philadelphia. Kyle, where are you right now, Kyle?
I'm on Long Island currently.
Long Island, all right. So in the age of Zoom, we can have these kinds of things remotely. What I wanted to do is maybe talk about some projects that these guys are working on and just really quick, just show off a couple of things. And the reason that I'm bringing on Jacob and Dave, I hope this is okay. I'm just gonna like show people one or two things, and then maybe just a conversation with you about how you think that these may fit all together in democracy reform. So we talked with Beto O'Rourke about these districts that he won in the Senate election 2 years ago, 9 districts, and then he lost 1 district in the Fort Worth area by 0.14 percentage point. Of those, it turns out that 8 of them are, 8 of them are what we call redistricting Moneyball. And I should say Jacob here is a mathematician, and Jacob and Connor Moffett and I developed a tool where we took district by district legislative ratings by a gentleman in Virginia named Chaz Nuttycombe. And his site is called C-Analysis. And we turned those into a model of understanding where legislatures could change control to generate bipartisan governance. And Jacob created a mathematical model. He and Connor figured out where the key districts were. And as I showed before, there are key districts all over the nation. We've been focused on Texas, but there's also key districts, in fact, in Kansas. So Kansas is a place where there may be bipartisan governance. Here in Wichita, there's a district that Steve Crum is running for. In the Kansas City area over here, in this purple trending area of Kansas City, which is trending Democratic. There's also bipartisan governance possible in Minnesota, where the Democrats may end up with single party control, but in fact, it may be possible for Republicans to prevent that. And so these are districts that Republicans can make competitive. The bottom line is that, that through mathematical modeling, we've figured out where people are really powerful. And so Jacob's done that. And you know, the other place that, that we are watching closely is the North Carolina state house race, where the state house or the state senate may in fact go change partisan hands, and we could end up with bipartisan governance in a state that's pretty well known for bitter partisanship in its legislation and in the battles between the legislature and the governor. So, so I don't know, Dave, do you think how much of this, what's your sense? Think this can help?
I think this is fantastic because we all feel this sense of what can I do, right? What can I do with this moment? And you see it every day. You see people funneling money into campaigns of US Senate candidates, perhaps one in Kentucky, for example, that is pretty down low on the list of actual seats where your dollars might make an impact. And yet there's tens of millions of dollars heading into that race. And for pennies on the dollar, what you can do is have real impact as far as fair redistricting on either side of the aisle. You have districts on here in Minnesota and in Connecticut that are important for Republicans to take, perhaps if they want to have a seat at the table. Districts in Texas, of course, where it is high dollar, a possibility of impact for assuring that both sides have a seat at the table when it comes to redistricting. You've got these fascinating races in Kansas and Wisconsin this year that a lot of people might not even know about, but vetoes are at stake. You have Democratic veto power over Republican maps on the line with just a couple of seats in both chambers in Wisconsin and also in Kansas. And people might not exactly understand where their dollars could make a big difference if they care about fair maps. And you have done an amazing service by kind of laying out precisely where those races are.
Well, that's nice of you to say. Yeah, Kansas is a weird one because they've got a Democratic governor, Republican supermajorities in the legislature, and just changing one state house seat can break that supermajority, and then the two parties have to work together to work on legislation, and nothing can get passed without having buy-in from both parties. So that's interesting. Talk about Wisconsin, because there's a famous gerrymander there. What can voters do in Wisconsin that's going to make things better?
You have a Democratic governor in Wisconsin, but you have pretty serious ultra gerrymandered state legislative chambers. You've had years in which Democratic candidates have won more votes, years in which Republican candidates have won more votes in Wisconsin this decade. But on these maps, they've barely budged. Democrats won 200,000 more votes statewide there for the assembly in 2018, picked up one seat and cut the Republican majority down to 63-36. So that is a pretty serious majority. Democrats
that's the state where the Supreme Court just said very recently that votes have to be in Wisconsin by 8 p.m. on election day. The Supreme Court struck down a lower court's ruling that ballots could arrive 6 days after. So they've put a hard wall on voting. And I don't know, if I'm from Wisconsin, I'm pretty mad about that.
Yeah, if I'm in Wisconsin, I'm fairly upset about, one of the most stringent voter ID bills in the country that was passed by this legislature. I'm upset that there's all these issues that are of concern to people there, whether it's police violence after the shooting in Kenosha, whether it is gun violence after major shootings, whether it's voting in the middle of a pandemic. And you've had a Democratic governor elected statewide who 3 times has tried to call in special sessions of this legislature, and they have gavelled in and out of them in a minute each time. So accountability, basic accountability has really gone missing in Wisconsin. In addition to that, this is a legislature that essentially sued to force voters to the polls back in April in the primary in the middle of a pandemic. So if both sides are to have a seat at the table there, if the governor's veto is to be sustained, you're really looking at I believe it's 3 seats in both the Senate as well as 3 seats in the House that if Republicans are able to flip those, they would be able to have a supermajority and to override Governor Evers's veto of those maps. So a lot at stake in all of these states, and certainly in a state where things have been as close as they have been in Wisconsin as far as the Electoral College. This is a race that matters for everybody.
Yeah. So just something came up in the Q&A. One way we can tell that there is partisan gerrymandering in the House. Dane wants to know if there's a Dane. That's a good name because there's like Dane County in Wisconsin. But Dane wants to know if there's a simple metric for understanding partisan gerrymandering. Dane, you came to the right place. You go over to gerrymander.princeton.edu, and we've got some simple metrics for you. A simple metric would be if one party's average wins are much larger than the other party's average wins, then that suggests that that one party got packed into a few districts. So in the case of Wisconsin, Democrats have average wins where their wins are like 80% or so. And then the Republicans' wins are very carefully engineered to be just teeny tiny wins, like 57%, that kind of win. And so when you have this kind of, it's sort of a bipartisan gerrymander, but one side gets really packed in tighter than the other. And there's a statistical test for telling when one average is out of whack with respect to another average. And that's called a t-test. So there's ways to tell. People who draw maps can tell by, you can have a computer draw 1 million maps and show that the map that's there is more extreme than 1 million other maps that the computer picks at random. So there's different ways to tell. I'll be interested in seeing whether Wisconsin can escape this, because I gotta say, I do wonder about whether it really will be, with changes in the courts. I'm curious about the way forward. So listen, in the remaining time, Dave, like, if you're okay with it, I know that in Unrigged, you talk about ways that people talk back and take control of government and like take back democracy. And if you're okay with it, maybe I thought I'd throw it over to Kyle, who's developed, along with some other students, a tool here at Princeton to help citizens talk back. And Kyle, if you're willing, maybe walk us through what you all did. And listen to me, I'm in New Jersey and I just talked with Beto O'Rourke for half an hour and suddenly I'm y'all. But anyway, what y'all do? What did all y'all do?
Yeah, sure thing, I'm happy to. So I'll share just a little bit about what representable is and what we're trying to do. And this is kind of part of, I think, what Beto was saying, which is, people, it's not enough to just vote, and there's other ways that people can have an input in the process. And that's really what representable is all about. So to start a little bit about representable, I'll start with an introduction to the problem itself, which is that communities like this one that you see here are often misrepresented and split by different district lines, particularly those communities that are most vulnerable. So proposed districts split this community in Prince William County up to 8 times, which tear apart the vibrant minority community, its voting base, into broken pieces with minimal impact. Across the country, communities in every state have been split in various ways, losing the ability to advocate for the resources and the representation that they deserve. That's why we made representable, which is based upon this legal term of community of interest. It's a legally enforceable fairness standard in more than half of states. Unfortunately, Texas is not one of them. However, there's still ways that you can use communities of interest as public input and to talk about.
I should say, Kyle, let me just interject that Texas would be a great place to do this because I believe their public input process is going online. And what that means is that it might be ideally suited for what you guys have developed. And we just need partners in Texas. And so this would be the right place to look for them right here if there's Texans on the call.
Yeah, and there's organizations doing a lot of great work on the ground in Texas fighting gerrymandering. So this is a great way for them to make sure that process is as transparent as possible. Because the problem is, up to this point, without any community data that's understandable to map makers and politicians that can be used to hold them accountable, the status quo is going to prevail, incumbents will rarely lose, and marginalized communities are going to continue to be forgotten. So that's really the motivation behind Representable, which is a platform to collect, analyze, and share crowdsourced community data to add more public input to democracy. And so just a quick overview of how it works is people can start by filling out our online survey. You annotate cultural, historical, economic, and social interests that bind a community together. Then you can draw a map. So you select block groups, basic units of the census that comprise your community, so they can be easily understood and used by map makers. Then it's added to our database, which is a powerful database of communities of interest used by organizations to advocate for their communities, by map makers to ensure that district plans take these communities into account, and by citizens and journalists to directly evaluate proposed maps. This data can be exported as a PDF or as GeoJSON, which is the industry standard, so that it can be used by map makers and also in public input as easily as possible. So we're really motivated by these 3 things, which is that the data is standardized and actionable. Anyone can analyze and critique the mechanisms of our representative democracy, ranging from local to even federal levels. And then through easily accessible digital tools for making communities visible, so that the voices of all backgrounds can be heard. And then this provides a mechanism of accountability for representatives. Journalists, concerned community members have the community information they need to ensure that our democracy represents all groups and unmasks what previously took place with an elite few behind closed doors. So that's just a brief overview of Representable. It's a critical time in our American democracy, as I'm sure everyone knows. We're focused on the upcoming redistricting cycle, in the process setting up the infrastructure to create routine change in many jurisdictions where community data can influence democracy at local, regional, and state levels for years to come. Thanks.
That's outstanding, Kyle. I have to say I really enjoyed watching the whole thing mature. First from a student project from a course, I believe was it Coast 333? Is that what it was?
Coast 333.
Yeah, so from a class project that develops like little apps and so on. And then you guys got more and more serious about it, and you got sucked in, and then and then other students got involved who are not taking it for credit. And so I hope that it turns into a tool that gets picked up. As Beto was saying, the question is how to make these things, how to get more people involved. And I have to say, I think Dave, in writing Unrigged, I see copies of Unrigged behind Dave on his shelf. And I really want everyone to go get a copy of Unrigged, because it describes ways in which citizens can get involved. And so, so Kyle, I'm really hoping that your tool will get into people's hands. I'm going to go troll around the Q&A a little bit. I wonder if you and Dave have any thoughts. Dave, anything occurred to you about, like, seeing this tool and like how it could end up, could it get used? Like who's gonna want this?
I think the question of how we define communities of interest is one of the most important ones that map makers have to struggle with, and it can so easily be manipulated, because what a map maker does when they draw a crooked line through a community is crack it in half. It's divide it in ways that don't make sense, and it is usually all in the name of a partisan political end, because they want the voters on one end of the street and they don't want the voters on the other end of the street. And we're fairly easy to divide that way after decades of redlining and racist housing practices. And there are districts which you can drive those jagged borders that look so funny when we see them, and what you see is just how precisely the district lines correspond to racial, economic, various other demographics. It is so precise, and so when you put these materials in the hands of people, you are changing the process. A subscription to Maptitude, which is the software package that the most sophisticated partisan map makers are using, can cost thousands and thousands of dollars. It's not usually in the hands of real people. When you take something like this and allow people to see, to show their lawmakers and to come up with sample maps that say, hey, this is a community that has to be kept together, and you give them that tool without charging them thousands of dollars, you are democratizing the very technology that has been used in deeply undemocratic ways over the course of recent years. That's what I think is so valuable about it.
I will say, Dave, you talk about to insiders who work on redistricting, Maptitude is both the industry standard and also comes in for some abuse because their software is horrifically expensive. But my understanding is that they may be opening up things a bit. There's free tools that the citizens can use to draw their own lines. Of course, for communities of interest, we've got representable.org, which was what Kyle was showing. There's Dave's Redistricting app, which is a free tool. But my understanding is that the Maptitude people, it's a company called Caliper, that they may be open to partnership to make their software more widely available. And we, I may as well announce it here as anywhere else, we are thinking about having a national fair maps drawing contest to help people draw better maps. And without getting too much into it, I would not be surprised if some of these very powerful softwares become more available to people. And anyone who's on this call should get back in touch with us, because I think that we're going to have some pretty good software tools for you available to draw professional grade maps. The price for entry might be that you got to enter our contest, but if you're a hobbyist and you use things like Dave's redistricting app, we want to help put those tools into your hands. Not only representable, but also maybe some of these high grade software tools. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I do think that the people who create these tools, at least some of them, I think understand that it is not a level playing field, and that we really have a problem with democracy in the US, where we are not little d Democratic, where the seats aren't representative of the people, and not little r Republican, where there's just no responsiveness of legislators to the people who voted them in. So anyway, so the point being, Dave, I don't know, I'm just saying some of these tools might be more available than 10 years ago when you wrote your first book on this topic.
I'm glad to hear that. The Maptitude people at the time, when I was writing, specifically refused to give me any access to it and refused to go on the record about how their software was being used. So I am glad to hear that they are sounding more small d Democratic a decade later.
You're not going to catch me saying a critical thing about them for the time being.
I had a feeling.
Let us just see what happens. Let's see what happens. I mean, like I cannot make promises quite yet, but we are hoping to help here at the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. We are hoping to help make these things available to a wide range.
Very, very powerful tool. I found other people with copies of it who showed me how to use it when I was writing the book, and it's unbelievable what it can do.
Well, I think the one thing that's one thing that's really the big talk among redistricting nerds is what's going to happen with the census. I mean, the census is looking like, is it going to be just a bad census with problems, or is it going to be a dumpster fire? And one of the problems right now is preventing it from becoming a full-blown dumpster fire. And one way to do that is through redistricting. Redistricting can have consequences that are actually many times larger than the worst census. You can draw a hell of a gerrymander that freezes people out. You can even, one thing we're talking about is the possibility that sophisticated redistricting can in some ways remediate or undo the consequences of a bad census. Obviously, things should be done carefully because there's a lot of trade-offs that go into drawing districts. But we are thinking about that as redistricting as a tool for basically remedying problems that have come out through a bad census. Well, let's see. So what else should we do here? I really appreciate all the things. Hey, by the way, Kyle, I just saw on the call, there are Texas organizations that are using Representable. Your empire, Kyle, has grown so large that we have not even mentioned Fair Maps, League of Women Voters in Texas, Texans Against Gerrymandering. These organizations are using Representable. Now, Texas is a large state. And so I think that what we really hope for is Jeffrey, who wrote this comment in, Jeffrey Sheh, said that they've been using it down at Texans Against Gerrymandering. But I think that we need more and more organizations around the country. So I really wish you all the success in growing Representable to be big and strong, and let the people's voice flow out like a mighty river. I'm sure I'm like totally mangling all those like things that people say, but anyway, but yeah, justice can flow forth. Or okay, I'm going to stop there. All right, Dave. Just in closing, before I thank everybody, thanks Jacob and thanks Kyle. I did curious, Dave. You've gone around the country looking at the future of democracy reform. We've got an election coming up next week. After the election, do you have any thoughts about what's interesting to you up ahead? Like what's exciting that you see in the next year? It's a hard time for optimism, but I wonder if you see any shoots of green as we maybe build back a little bit from where we've been.
As we build back better, right?
I didn't. I came within a hair's breadth of saying that.
You came
we-
close.
building
We built
democracy back.
NATO. Yes. I think there's a lot of reasons for optimism. You know, I mean, I think that what we saw in 2018 with all of these initiatives around the country, the 5 on redistricting, Florida on voting rights for the formerly incarcerated, are all worthy of being excited about. I think the energy this year that I do think has flowed down ballot, the awareness of these important state legislative races in all of these states, I think has been really exciting to see. You know, groups like Run for Something, which have been, you know, so instrumental in ensuring that there are candidates seeking office at all of these levels. The determination of people to stand in lines to vote, I think, is remarkable. I think it's outrageous that they should have to, but it's remarkable that people are doing it. And I think that there is just such awareness right now that what we are looking at is a need for big, serious, structural democracy reform, and the potential of that happening, the potential that the conversation appears to be changing around the courts as well. I don't think we can have any conversation about voting rights and democracy that doesn't involve some look at how we do judicial reform as well. But there seems to be real movement on all of these fronts and a real sense that we have to get it to work.
The thing is, it's going to be a challenge. And I got to say, depending on what happens next week, that's going to be the starting material for doing this. And I think that the kinds of things you're talking about need to happen in communities and states all over the country. So, as Lyndon Johnson said, let us continue. All right. Well, thank you, Dave, and thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Jacob, for helping show off these great tools and for talking about what comes next for Texas and the nation. I thank you all for sticking around. I see from the participant number that actually a surprising number of you stuck around. I'm very pleased that you came for Beto and you stayed for the nerdy technical talk. So that was really nice of you. Thank you all. This has been another episode of Fixing Bugs in Democracy. I encourage you all to come learn about what we're doing here at Princeton and the connections that we've made nationwide. You can find us at gerrymander.princeton.edu, and you can take a look at the Redistricting Moneyball tool and other election analytics at election.princeton.edu. So thanks, guys, and thanks to everyone for coming out tonight.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay, let's put up the slide and of Beto so we can look at him, and then we'll wish everyone a good night. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, some questions were not answered, my email address is sswang@princeton.edu. Good night. Jason, keep it on a sec. I'm going to look at the questions real quick.
Sure thing.
Roger Scott. Fair districting is on the ballot in Virginia in the form of Amendment 1. There's a measure to undo fair districting in Missouri. That's Measure 3. And so the pro-reform move is to vote yes on 1 in Virginia, vote no on 3 in Missouri. Those are 2 things that are happening out there right now, and these may affect redistricting. Those are the big things. There's another measure here in New Jersey that's not so great, but I would not characterize it as real headline-making stuff. David, using an AI is to do redistricting is not a great move because it can't take into account all the back and forth between communities and people. And also furthermore, no citizens would or politicians would give up their power to AI. Algorithms can certainly be used to measure fairness, but you would no more give authority to an algorithm to draw districts than you would give the design of a table to a carpenter's level. And so just keep in mind that these softwares can be used to measure, but not to create. And so that's approximately where it's at. And then finally, John asks, is there a concern about bipartisan map making? Will just protect incumbents of both parties? This is a very good point. Really fair districting should in fact make competitive districts in a natural way. And so one difficulty of bipartisan governance is that it's not quite as good as independent governance when it comes to district drawing. And so the gold standard is independent commissions, and bipartisanship is a stepping stone to at least getting partway there. And then Evan wants to know about undercount in the census, what that's going to do to redistricting. Undercounts can have effects in places where there are undercount susceptible populations like Latino populations in Texas. And one difficulty is finding ways to correct for those errors. And there are people who are hard at work thinking of ways to correct for it. People in the Census Bureau, people, redistrictors nationwide. And so I think there are ways to fix that. One would be to just draw districts with a little bit less population. That's allowed within state law and federal law. And so you can in fact compensate slightly for a poorly conducted census with an undercount. So that's just a smattering of answers to these questions. Thanks everyone and good night.